There never is much telling what's going to happen when you go exploring the middle of nowhere. I hope you brought a flashlight, as it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A couple of years ago, I met this guy at a party who told my friend and I about an abandoned house that he used to explore a lot and take pictures in. We asked him to take us there one night so that we could explore, and although he seemed a bit hesitant, he agreed and we made plans. A couple of nights later, they pick me up and this guy directs us to the house. Turns out, it's behind a field on a street that I've lived about 10 minutes from my whole life. On our way there, he tells us a quick backstory behind the house. Decades ago, probably in the early 1900s, the house was an orphanage run by a priest. The priest started acting strangely, and someone decided to send an exorcist to check the place out. The exorcist sensed that the evil spirits were coming out of the well, so they closed it up and built a new one. Not too long after, the priest killed the children and then himself in the house, and it has been abandoned ever since. While this story definitely creeped me out a little, I was skeptical. I wasn't too sure that I believed in evil spirits, or possessions or anything of the sort. We finally get there, after having a lot of trouble trying to find the mostly hidden gravel road, because the field was pretty overgrown. We drive down between the road, and I'm feeling a little creeped out. Especially once we get to the clearing and the house becomes visible. The property consisted of a house with a small shed on one side and a decent barn on the other. The guy tells us that the shed and barn are pretty run down inside, so it wouldn't be safe to explore much, so we decided to just stick to the house. As we walk into the woods and closer to the house, he gets visibly anxious and quieter. We make our way inside, and we get to the front room, when he tells us his story. He and his friends had gone in there for the last time a couple of months ago, and were smoking in the exact spot that we were, when they saw what he described as a shadow figure come out of the room to our right, that was full of black mold. He claims the figure chased him and his friend out of the house and down the road until they had safely driven away. He tells us that's why he's so anxious, and understandably so. We still decide to explore further, and we make our way upstairs. I stop feeling so uneasy, and I start to have fun exploring. It's definitely still creepy, but I haven't had any bad feelings or seen or heard anything strange so far. We get down to the basement, and the kid tells us that that's where he had always felt the most uneasy. As soon as we entered one of the rooms, the darkest one, he suggests that we turn off our flashlights and sit there to see if we sense anything. I go over and sit under the stairs, and as soon as we turn off our lights, I feel the strongest sense of dread I've ever felt, and suddenly my shoulders feel heavy. It feels as if something or someone is sitting on them. I freeze for a second, and then turn on my flashlight and demand that everyone does the same. I tell them what I felt, and feel pretty silent. My friend chimes in, and says that he's not feeling too great either, so we decide to leave. We get in the car, and the guy and I stand outside to smoke a cigarette, whilst the rest of the group waits in the car. We smoke in silence, and as I'm looking back at the abandoned buildings, I notice a light coming from what looks like the second floor window of the barn. Without noticing, I start walking towards it, It felt as if something was pulling me there. The guy sees me doing that and grabs me and pulls me back. He tells me that he knows what I'm feeling and that he had felt the same thing the first time he'd came here. He told me he felt the strongest urge to go back there for days afterwards, and he did. He went back as often as he could, until the incident with the shadow figure. After we finished our cigarettes, we get in the car and we drive all the way back down to my house in silence. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and for days after that, I hardly slept and had troubled dreams. I felt the same way the guy told me that he felt. I had the strongest urge to go back, but I didn't. Every night for at least a week afterwards, I felt like I wasn't alone. Then I got sick, sore throat and a bad cold, a really bad cold. I even lost my voice for a few days. My mental health began to decline. I was always angry, and I was becoming quite depressed. I had a history of mental health issues and hospitalization, but I had been doing really well for the past year or so. No more than 2 weeks after my trip to the house, things got really bad, and I checked myself into the hospital and stayed there for 2 weeks. Ever since then, whenever I pass the spot where I know the house is, I feel the slightest urge to just turn into the gravel road and go back into the house. Of course, I never do, and I know I will never, ever go back there. I've told quite a few people this story, and almost no one believes me, but it's definitely true, and is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. I had a few years where I was sort of down on my luck. I live in an area with a lot of relatives, so one of my aunts was having a party, and I ended up staying a lot later than I should have. There was free beer, so I had to, and I got a bit intoxicated, and when my cousin who was supposed to be driving me home wanted to leave, I declined because I wanted to keep drinking. So he left, and I was without a ride home. When I finally left, I had an extremely long and uncomfortable walk ahead of me. Whilst you might think that my aunt or someone else could have given me a lift home, my family was a little tired of having to drive me places. So I prepared for a really long walk down this country road. Although I had been drinking, the atmosphere outside sobered me up pretty quickly. It was really dark and very brisk. And for some strange reason, it was eerily quiet. I mean, usually there are all sorts of animal noises. You know, crickets and frogs and other things. But this night, everything was calm and quiet. I did become aware of some noises in the woods though. You know, as if an animal were walking back there. And the noises didn't go away either, which made me start to think that an animal might be following me. Of course, I was very nervous at this point. I didn't fancy being something's midnight snack, and I tried to hurry up a little bit, and I did get slightly ahead of the noises, so I figured that I'd be okay. However, right then, I heard a sound of several twigs breaking, but the sound stopped there. I had a feeling that whatever had been following me was now directly behind me, but it wasn't moving. I told myself to keep walking, but part of me said I just had to turn around and see. So very slowly, I forced myself to turn around, and when I saw my pursuer, I screamed. There was this large, dark figure standing behind me, and it had to be nearly 8 feet tall. The worst part, though, was that it had red, glowing eyes, and it stood there staring down at me. Well, I took off running right away, and I was so terrified that I didn't even notice if it was following me. I didn't know how far I actually ran, and if it followed me at all. But finally, after an eternity, I ventured to look back and saw nothing. It was still eerily quiet, and I was terrified, but I walked the rest of the way home. Now, I know everyone would just tell me that I was drunk and imagined it, but never before has drinking beer caused me to hallucinate. I know what I saw that night, and I never went for a walk in the middle of nowhere again. In the early to mid-90s, when I was a teenager, I used to spend all my free time out in the woods, often alone, but sometimes in the summer. My buddy and I would carry my small canoe through the trails we made, over a mile to a somewhat remote lake. There was a small dirt road that went by the lake, and a house on the far side. The only place for us to launch my canoe was a small opening in the woods by an old collapsed duck blind. We made this trip a dozen times each summer as teenagers to go fishing. We would use the collapsed duck blind as a makeshift dock, walking across it to climb into and launch the canoe. Around this same time, at a golf course around 3 miles away from my parents' house, a woman just showed up and disappeared one night, leaving her car parked at the clubhouse with no signal of foul play. The winter after she went missing, we went out ice fishing in the middle of the lake. Right as the sun set, a vehicle pulled into the turnaround overlooking the lake about 200 yards away, headlights panning across the lake to us. The vehicle just sat there watching us for 15 minutes and left. We thought this was a little strange, as it's a pretty rural area and random cars don't really come and park there. We fished until late and then went home. Nothing else eventful happened. The next spring, as soon as the lake ice was gone, we went with my canoe again, bouncing on the duck blind, using it as a makeshift urinal being teenagers. And this time, we noticed a foul odour at the duck blind and joked that the hunter was dead underneath it. We never thought about it twice. Out in the woods or by the lake once in a great while, you'd come across a dead animal, so we never thought anything. That summer, I moved away from the area. A few years after I moved away, my dad called me to tell me that the missing girl had been found dead. She had been kidnapped, raped, murdered and buried under a duck blind at the edge of the lake we always fished at. She had been right under that duck blind for almost a year by the time they found her. All the time we were just out there fishing, totally unaware that she was right there. I called my buddy, and he reminded me of the weird car watching us whilst we were out ice fishing in the winter. We wonder if it was the guy just coming back to check the spot that he'd dumped the body the previous summer. Thankfully, the killer was caught and put in prison shortly after. I lived in rural Massachusetts. To anyone who's familiar, that means miles of wood, with spaced out suburban areas in between. I was walking down my grandfather's logging trail, getting ready for his funeral. I'm also an avid mushroom collector, so I'm always walking slowly and staring at the ground. Friends hate me for it. So I get to this cool little white-capped mushroom and stop to take a close-up picture of it. And that's when I heard it. The best way I can describe it is if someone with a lot of flesh on his knuckles was punching a tree. Now I know what deer sound like when they stomp to protect their children, and I know what smashing antlers on trees sounds like. I've heard bears, fisher cats, moose, pretty much any animal in western Massachusetts that exists. So naturally I looked up, freaked the hell out. It was so rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. And went on for minutes at the same pace. So being the curious person that I am, I let out a whistle that couldn't be mistaken for a bird. I'm looking in the direction of the thudding, and can see about 75 to 100 yards through my grandfather's well-trimmed trees, and see nothing. Right after my whistle, I hear a low, quick whistle back. My first thought is, oh, it must be some logger arsehole scooping the land past the no trespassing gate. So I yell, "Hello?" pretty much as loud as I can. Then whatever it was, ran away faster than I've ever heard a human being run. And using my experience with deer and dogs and moose and bears, I assessed that it couldn't rationally be a four-legged creature. I know what they sound like running, and this was much closer to something bipedal. I'm 100% positive on that. What doesn't make sense, however, is that a two-legged creature that ran away from me faster than any two-legged creature I'd ever heard before, and it also sounded like it was at least 250 pounds. The steps were loud and frantic. A lot of people believe Bigfoot has a spiritual connection with the forest it remains in, and thus the creatures in it as well. I did not find it a coincidence that this happened on the day of my grandfather's funeral, and I ran all the way home.
This takes place a little over a year ago, some weekday around midnight in central Ohio. I want to preface this by saying I'm not particularly religious, nor do I necessarily believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something weird happened that night that I can't explain. This story is 100% true, except for some certain details that have been changed to remain anonymous. So let's call it a Wednesday, as I don't quite remember what day it was, but it was around 5 p.m. A friend tells me about an abandoned building her friend showed her the day before, and asked if I wanted to check it out sometime. Of course I do, but being the curious soul that I am, I wanted to go that night, whereas she could not. I asked a few other friends to make the journey with me, and they all decline either because they aren't into the whole B&B trespassing thing, or they're otherwise just busy. I decide to go alone. This isn't something I usually do, as I have a few close friends who are just as experienced as I am in the urbex, and the three of us are an excellent team when it comes to stuff like this. I've gone to places alone before, but never with this little research done on the area. I couldn't find anything on the internet about this place. I decided to say fuck it and go, as I'm not one to back down from an opportunity like this. So I grabbed my bag, flashlight, camera, and I'm on my way. I tell someone exactly where I'll be in case something happens, and to call the police if I stop responding for a few hours. I arrive about a mile from the location, and start my journey. Most of it is just woods and creeks, but the last bit is a parking lot. I get to the lot, and see not one but two buildings to explore. This is turning out better than I expected. I chose to go in the building on the left, as it looks more easily accessible, and start looking for a way in. Around the back, I find some metal stairs that have been overgrown and look like they're close to collapsing. I decide to take my chances and slowly climb them, keeping my eyes on each step to make sure I'm not going to fall through or anything. I climb the stairs just fine and get to the second floor. The door is closed, but opens just fine, no padlock or anything, and I'm in. Looking around with my flashlight, this place is in better shape than a lot of abandoned buildings around my location. Part of the roof has been caved in from a tree falling, but everything else looks pretty good. I walk around the entrance room a bit more, and realize where I am. There are note cards all over the floor with basic information on people. First and last names, address, date of birth, diagnosis code, and inpatient or outpatient with a check next to one. I'm in a psychiatrist's office. Nice. I love these kinds of places, and insane asylums are my favorite places to explore. I have a seat and look through some of the patient cards. I look up diagnosis codes and try to profile who the person was. No particular reason, just interesting stuff. After a bit of this, I stand up and continue my journey. Now, the way this building is set up is there's basically a giant letter I, with the entrance stairs I used at the bottom, and boarded up the main entrance in the center. The only set of stairs to the first floor are at the top of the I. I look around some of the second floor room, and don't really see much. Mostly empty offices with a chair or lamp in the room. I do, however, find a room that I assume was for children to play in, while their parents were seeing a psychiatrist. It had a sandbox and some toys laying around, but I noticed someone took some of the sand and drew a pentagram on the floor with it. I chuckled at this. After seeing everything I needed to see on the second floor, I go down to the first floor. The stairs are steep and winding, but very sturdy. I check the door to make sure it won't lock behind me, and make my way down. The first floor is basically just a long hallway with rooms along one side, and a reception area on the other. I start checking out the rooms on the right side. After a few interesting rooms, break room, kitchen, storage closet with Christmas stuff inside, I come across this office with something interesting on the desk. Before getting to that, I want to pose a question. Why does every abandoned building have Christmas stuff in it? Like seriously, 90% of the buildings I've been to have fake trees, wreaths, garland, or something like that. What gives? Anyway, back to the show. So on the desk in the office is a set of post-it notes. On these notes are messages that make me feel a little uneasy. They go like this. He is planning on letting the hostages out. 4:30. Do we have staff accountability yet? 4:35. Can Officer John escort Jane out of the room? 4:42. This is where things start to get weird. As soon as I take the picture on my phone, the entire building starts shaking violently. My first thought was earthquake. Now, I'm not speaking from experience, but I have to assume an old building isn't the type of place you want to be during an earthquake. So I start to make my way back down, only this time, rather briskly. As I get upstairs, I notice the door I propped open to keep from locking me down there was now only slightly ajar. The small piece of metal I popped it open with was nowhere to be seen, although I didn't look very hard. As I'm jogging my way out through the building, I noticed that every door I had opened upstairs was now closed tight. What the hell? Was someone fucking with me? I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I was leaving the larger room I entered through, I noticed the door I came in was shut. I pulled on it, but nothing. The fucking thing wouldn't open. Now, I'm pretty calm under pressure, but this was beginning to be too much. I was starting to freak out a bit. I made the quick decision to force my way out. Typically, I hate doing any damage to a building I'm exploring, and usually try to avoid it whenever possible, but this was a special case. I wanted the fuck out of here. Kicking the door down? I've done it before, but this door didn't seem like it was going anywhere. It opens the other way and was very sturdy. I guess I'm kicking out of the pressboard covering the window next to it. Luckily, these windows were huge and low enough where I could get a foot onto the wood. 2 kicks and the wood gives out. The building is still shaking, so I made a hasty getaway down the stairs. This is the part that still spooks me. As soon as my feet hit the ground on the last step, the building stopped shaking. Completely. Everything around me was silent. I must have been going crazy. I knew what I felt, and I know what I saw. I got out of there and didn't look back. A few weeks later, my crew freed up and wanted me to show them the place, even after I told them this story. Oddly enough, every other time I've been there, nothing out of the ordinary has happened. I'm not sure what happened or why, and I'm not one to believe it was a ghost or anything, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake me up a bit. Was it just a well-timed earthquake? Possibly. but I heard nothing about it on the news the next day, and nobody else said they felt or heard anything.
A few friends and myself were hanging out at my house bored one night, and started telling stories about things that we've seen or felt to scare each other. My girlfriend at the time, who had lived in the area a little longer than most of us, started telling us about an abandoned mental hospital that was only about a half-hour from my house. She told us that somewhere on its grounds were entrances to underground tunnels and rooms that kept some of the buildings and sidewalks warm. We decided to go out and look there for ourselves, and after roaming the halls and rooms for a while, we came across the steps. Once we got to the basement, we found one of the tunnels, so I walk over and shine my flashlight down the hall to see where it went. The hall was long enough to the point that I couldn't see the end of it, and I could only see blackness. I couldn't see any doorways or even a tunnel that crossed paths with this one. But as I'm looking down this tunnel, I see this figure kind of slide halfway out of a doorframe. I didn't see it before. It's sitting with its knees up to its chin, both its arms resting on its knees overlapping each other. It's skinny like leather over bone and very pale. Its eyes were like softball size, and they were glowing this weird yellowish blue colour. At this point, I'm sort of crouched down staring at this thing. I can't even think straight enough to get myself a way out of this hall. And that's when it spoke to me. I'll never forget what it said.
Come on. Come on down here and see what we have. Why don't you come on over? Come on.
I stood up. I didn't want to, but I took a step forward. Every muscle in my body wanted me to turn around and leave, but I was frozen. As soon as I took that first step, I felt something grab my arm, and heard a voice from behind me say, "Run." I left my friends down there, but I ran all the way through the hospital and back to my friend's car. They caught up with me quickly and we raced out the place. We did stop at a White Castle before we got home, and we found handprints on the back bumper of his rearview window. Needless to say, I've never gone back to that place, and have no intention of ever doing so. Okay, so I have a story that happened to me and my friends. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping/shooting trip. There are about 30 of us. We were in a little cabin with windows on the front and back, as well as a front and back door and wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin, with the bathroom, was around an eighth of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. There was obviously a buddy system because it was Boy Scouts. So it's around midnight, and everyone had been telling scary stories, like normal camping trips. I had to go to the bathroom, and asked my friend to come along. He said sure, and we got our knives, and we went to the bathroom, and we began our walk back. This was where it got scary. I felt an instinctual fear. I looked to my friend, and he had the same look as me. We start to walk slightly faster, and unfold our pocket knives. I then turn around and see it. It looked like a cat, but it was around 6 feet tall and on its hind legs, kinda hunched over. I freaked the heck out and started running. My friend sees it too, and we sprint back to the cabin. It began making a moaning/howling sound and followed us slowly. We pound on the door, and the guys let us in. We told them what we saw, and they actually believed us. So we lock the front door and look at the back door. It had no lock. We pushed the table up against it and had a kid sit there with his knife for safety. We drew the blinds on all the windows that had them, and one of them didn't even shut, and we just sat there with all the lights on. Then we see the eyes outside of the window with no blinds. We were all shitting ourselves, and then the thing slowly walked to the back door. We heard bumping against it, but then it left. But we still thought that we were going to die. No one slept. And when the adults came to wake us up, we told them and they laughed and said that we were making it up. Everyone in that cabin knew it happened, even if they didn't believe us. It was mental. I used to regularly walk portions of the Appalachian Trail, and usually take a week or two by myself. Anyway, at one point I was coming over a pass and saw a figure on the trail ahead. Seems to be a lone young woman. It's twilight and the moon will be bright. I have solar rechargeable lamps, and I yell ahead, "Ahoy!" She doesn't break stride or pause. Being on the trail, people are friendly and cooperative. Looks like she's had a bad day, and no tent. Now sure, I like to sleep under the stars, and I usually hike with a hammock and a rainfly, but something seemed off. We were way out here. The last trail shelter was a few miles back, and we were on a very heavy bush cliff. Nowhere you want to camp for the night. I figure she might be wary of strangers at night, so I keep my own pace and don't really pay much more attention to her, until she disappears over the next pass, and I realise she's walking this trail. Now dark, with some moonlight but heavy tree cover, without a torch, lamp or any personal light source. I'm getting worried about this girl. Remember, we are walking with a sheer cliff face a few yards away from us, and conditions aren't perfect. Roots, dirt, mud, moss, rocks, anything can trip you up. So I pick up pace and hurry over to the pass. She's nowhere, and there's a clear line of sight probably 200 yards ahead, and she's nowhere to be seen. But then I see a torch in the distance. Red lamp. Actually, there's two now that I'm getting closer. I flash my torch, and they flash theirs. I call ahoy, and a man and woman respond. We finally meet up and do the whole meet and greet, exchange trail names and chat for a bit about what's ahead in our paths, since we were walking opposite directions. I say to the girl, "You worried me back there. I saw you walking without a light and then you disappeared over the pass. I'm sorry I spooked you. Didn't think you were that far off though. Must have run like crazy to cover as much ground." She looked confused. "What are you talking about?" I explained everything, and she said that she hadn't seen anyone on the trail for at least 3 miles. There was no one reported missing, no abandoned campsites, nothing. I followed up with state police and rangers. Nothing. Who the hell was on the trail ahead of me? Walking at night with no light, minimal gear, and then to just suddenly disappear when there's only one way to go along the trail? I'm still clueless.
My best friend's aunt died under some fairly mysterious circumstances when we were younger. It took several days for anyone to realize they hadn't heard from her, so her body was left in her house for several days. Fast forward to when I was 15 and he was 17. It was late one night in the summer and we were hanging out at his house. The three of us, myself, my brother, and our friend, were discussing the paranormal and similar themes. Brian told us how he was convinced that it was all real because some of the stuff he saw happened in his aunt's old house a couple years earlier. He convinces us to ride down to her old house and check it out to see if anything creepy happens. 45 minutes later, we arrive at the house. It's been nearly 10 years since anyone lived there, so everything is choked out by weeds and tall grass. Brian grabs a bag of flashlights and a video camera, and we walk up to the front porch. At this point, my brother loses his nerve and goes back to the car. Brian and I continue towards the front door, and I feel it. A heavy, freezing cold presence just in front of the door. Even though it was a summer night in North Carolina, it was still pushing 90 degrees. I had goosebumps all over my body, but we decided to go in the house anyways. We immediately turn on all the flashlights, and he fires up the video camera. He's telling me the story of how he and his dad stayed here for a few weeks after his parents got divorced, and I honestly started to lose my cool. The biggest part of the story was how he woke up in the middle of the night to see a tall silhouette standing in his doorway. Thinking it was his dad, he doesn't mind. When the silhouette turns to leave, he rolls over to go back to sleep. Instead, he decides to get up and grab a glass of water. He walks down the hall and sees the silhouette heading into his dad's room. Young Brian decided to follow it, still thinking it was his dad. Instead, he reaches the door to see a shape pressing a pillow over his dad's face, trying to smother him. He yells and turns the light on, and the shape disappears. So at this point, I'm already pretty convinced there's something there, but we press on, and Brian sits down at the kitchen table. He asked his Aunt Linda to let him know if she's still here, and we wait. Maybe 30 seconds go by, and one of the cabinet doors slowly opens. Unconvinced, Brian asks her again to tell him if she's here. The hall closet door slams open. I was finally done. I grabbed my flashlight to go, and the door of the front of the house slammed shut, and my flashlight went out. So that was the night I decided that there was definitely some truth to it.
Back in the colonial days, there were people called wreckers. They would stand on beaches with lanterns and trick ships into running aground, and then loot the ship and kill anyone who survived on the beach. They'd then drag the bodies into the water to make it look like an ordinary shipwreck. Well, one night on an east beach in Rhode Island, I was fishing with my father. As we got down to the beach, we saw some odd drag marks in the sand. After about an hour and a half of casting, we made our way back to the truck. As we hit the parking lot, our German Shepherd began acting really weird. We were loading up the truck with our gear when we saw a light coming out from the dunes. As we got a good look, we saw it was an old 17th or 18th century lantern. When we saw 2 more lights, and 4 people walked out wearing colonial clothes. Our hearts pretty much stopped beating at that point. We threw everything into the truck, piling in on our growling dog, and blasted out of there. As we pulled out, our lights went right over the people, and we saw them clearly. They were wearing ratty colonial style clothes, and it really freaked us out. Never went fishing there again at night. A few years ago when I was 14, my mum and I went to this abandoned hotel where my grandparents spent their honeymoon back when they got married. When we pulled over, there was an old man sitting on a white plastic chair outside of the main entrance. He looked like he was some sort of keeper, and he tells us that this place has been abandoned for some years, but was recently acquired to be remodeled and open for business once more. He lets us go in and walk around, and I remember walking through the lobby behind the counter. They had the shelf where they kept all the keys for the rooms and mail, and there were still some keys and paper there. The usual broken window and graffiti with all the furniture and stuff left behind gave me an eerie feeling. After checking out the pool, we go back through the lobby and make our way through one of the halls that leads to the bedroom. I tried opening a door, but it was either jammed or locked, so we walked to the next one. I turned the knob, pushed it a bit, and someone slammed it shut from the inside. I remember looking back at my mum, and without saying anything we both started running to the lobby entrance. As we got closer, we started walking, so as not to raise any concerns from the old keeper. So we stepped outside to the big open space where he was sitting. We walk past the keeper, and perhaps take 5 more steps when we turn our heads to say thanks before finally getting in the car. But the guy wasn't there anymore, and there was no corners nearby where he could have gone, and we were close enough that if he had ran or moved, we should have heard him. I remember Mum and I told that story to the family between laughs, but we were truly scared at the time it happened. I spend a lot of time camping on the beach, in Yosemite, and all over California really. But one particular Friday night, my friends and I decided to camp in the woods near Hicks Road. It's a notorious road for fatal car accidents, squatters in abandoned homes, and the like. This is about our 3rd time camping up there. The last few times we heard some freaky noises, but nothing awful. So we pitch a tent in a small clearing, and plough through a Taco 12-pack before we crash out. I fell asleep no problem, and wake up to the sound of what seems like people arguing outside my tent. It was 4:30 in the morning, and I stand up slowly and peek out into the darkness, and see a massive black mass moving, looking through the other tent windows. I see there's probably close to 6 or 7 of them. They are absolutely huge and lumbering. I sat down in complete and utter silence for around 45 minutes, whilst I heard those behemoths around the tent. They were so close I could hear them brushing the fabric. Eventually they left, and when the sun came up, I knew why they were there. We didn't eat the last taco.
My friend and I, both girls, live in a rural farming community in northwestern Tennessee. We've always been interested in exploring abandoned places, and the area we lived in was full of them. Old houses, churches, schools, factories, etc. One such factory was an old pajama factory in a very small town that I had kinda grown up in. I was too chicken to explore it by myself when I was younger, and the friends I had had at the time weren't interested. When I got into high school, and met my current best friend though, we decided to take a look. The place is extremely run down with the roof caving in, overgrown, and just kinda gross in the office parts of the building, where the carpet had essentially turned into a moldy, gelatinous mush. The front doors to the main building were glass, and had been broken out, so we slipped through easily. I remember taking a tour of the building for school when I was younger, and I remember the office building feeling so nice and homey. It didn't feel like that anymore, obviously. We are exploring the darkened hallways. Ceiling tiles have fallen, and the wood panel on the wall sliding off, warped and rotting. The floor squelched under our feet, and so far, it was only mildly intimidating. We found old computers and papers. I even took a roll of big sticky labels to draw on, and tag things with. Then, we got to the factory-esque part of the building. It was dark, and just felt off in general, like someone was watching us. We both decided to keep going, decided to try and go through the factory to the large open bay door on the other side of the building. My friend and I crept further into the room when we hear glass shatter. It echoes through the large open space we're in, and a quick look with our flashlights tells us that it wasn't us. Where we were standing was just a large, empty concrete floor, nothing around but a few scattered papers. It should have bolted right then, but we were stubborn, and kept going after steeling ourselves. Mama didn't raise no coward. Still, there's that sense of uneasiness, and with the shattering glass, I'm on high alert. We come upon a hallway that was odd. The walls looked like they were covered with insulation and white plastic, most of it rotten and tearing away. Some of it was already on the floor, As we step into this hallway, everything within me just screams to run. I look at my friend and she's white as a sheet. I look forward and I find out why. There's a big black figure standing in the room at the end of the hall. Just standing there, menacingly. I'm like, it's time to go. And my friend and I take off as fast as our legs can carry us through that factory. I can hear someone screaming. And it sounds like they're saying something. But over the sound of my own breath and the echo of our panicked footsteps, I can't make it out. We find the bay doors, run through them, and literally launch ourselves off of that concrete docking bay into the woods. We only stop for a second, and I can make out the words then. Come to Daddy. I'll kill you. We booked it. Haven't been back since. Recently, they demolished the place, and now it's just an empty concrete lot. Not the creepiest experience, but that one definitely stuck in my head. We were 17, 18 at the time, and it could have just been some wacko messing with us. But I hate to think what could have happened if we hadn't gotten out of there when we did.
About 10 years ago, my family and I were up in the White Mountains of Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My dad was driving our truck with my grandpa in the front seat, and my mum and sister in the back seat. I was in the bed of the truck along with our family's German Shorthair pointer. We were driving along a forest road, and all of a sudden my dog starts barking and growling. So I looked to see what it is, thinking it's a bear or mountain lion. What I saw was a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road, about 60 to 70 yards away. I yelled at my dad to stop the truck. When I told him I think I see the Bigfoot, he just laughed and continued to drive. When I looked back to get another look, the figure had changed direction and was walking away from the road. The last thing I ever saw was the thing's head disappearing down a hill. To this day, I still do not have any explanation for what I saw, and every time the situation comes up, my dad always makes me tell the story so he can just have a laugh at it. 4 years ago, in my freshman year of college, me and a few friends went to check out the haunted bridge in town. It was in the woods over a creek, right behind a shopping center. The story goes that multiple people had died on the bridge over the years, and that the ghost of a man who died arguing with his wife haunted the bridge. We get to the bridge, and it's about 20 feet above the ground, having to walk up a steep hill to reach it, and it had steep drops to the side. We go across the bridge and walk about 100 yards down the roads past it, and nothing happened. So we turn around light-hearted, as it seemed to be a hoax. As we turn and start making our way back, we all start hearing very heavy and loud footsteps in the woods, right next to us. The creepy part was that they stopped when we stopped walking, and started back when we did. My friend yells, "Hey!" loudly, thinking that it would scare off the animals following us. But nothing happened. We make it back to the edge of the bridge and could hear it in the woods just below the hill. I was carrying a small 38 special in case of hobos, and called out, "I have a gun! Leave us alone or I'll shoot!" At that moment, all of the trees blew as if a strong wind of gust came, and a voice, louder than anything I've ever heard, screamed at us. We all promptly sprinted to our cars and sped away to the Waffle House and figured that we'd just had an encounter with a ghost. A friend of mine and I were hiking through the woods. It was dark out, and we were beginning to head back towards home, when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood, and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and keeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got the feeling that we were being watched. We tried to shrug it off and keep moving. Further down the trail, we saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided stupidly that we were going to get to the bottom of this. So we started after it, and it started charging. We screamed and it stopped, and then took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took off after it. I ran for a bit through the woods until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched as another popped up beside it, then another, and then I heard moving to the side of me, realizing that whatever these things were, they had surrounded me. I quickly noped out of there in the direction I left my friend, so I know that sounds like the creepy part, but it gets weirder. My friend wasn't there when I'd left him. So I called out to him, and he responded a little away, followed by, "You've got to see this." So I followed his voice and came to a clearing. It was bright as hell, and floating around the clearing were legit balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from The Legend of Zelda. These were pure white light, and we looked at each other, and then hightailed it back to the trail and went home. It was definitely the strangest and scariest thing I've ever witnessed. My cousin and I were fishing late at night. We decided to go around 9 p.m, since that's when it's the best time for us to go and get a bite. We got to our spot and there was nothing but the two of us, the lake, and your normal chirp chirp of some other random animal sounds, which we were used to. Around 30 minutes into our peaceful night of fishing, suddenly things went quiet. If you've ever gone to our spot, you know that this just doesn't happen. We didn't say anything and we kept on with our night. But suddenly, there was a loud screaming sound coming from behind us. I turned to look at my cousin, but this time his face was pale, and we asked out loud at the same time, "Did you hear that?" "Yes, I did." "What was it?" "I don't know, I've never heard that before," he said. As much as we both tried to ignore it, we kept alert, but then it passed, and after about an hour or so we'd forgotten about the incident completely. We didn't catch much, so we decided to pack up and call it a night. When we were heading back to our truck, we started hearing leaves rustling behind us. We turned around thinking it was an animal, but nothing was there. We kept on, and right as we were about to hop into our truck, a woman appeared right in front of us, at least a few feet away. She looked dirty and a little beat up with some blood stains on what seemed to be a nightgown. We shouted, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She just continued to stare at us, and then made the same shrieking scream that we'd heard before. My cousin and I were petrified and got into our car and drove off. We haven't been back to our fishing spot ever since, and we never told anyone what happened, but I can still hear that scream in my mind if I think about it hard enough. I was on a 4-day canoeing trip with friends in a remote part of the southeastern United States, back when I was a young teen. We were up late, built a bonfire, and goofed off as young boys do. I'm sure we were making a lot of noise. Eventually the fire died down to coals, and we were just sitting around talking when we heard a distant high-pitched scream. It freaked us out for a little, but eventually we forgot about it and just went back to talking. A while later, one of my friends pointed to the opposite banks of the river and says, "Guys, what is that?" We looked, and standing there in the trees was a huge silhouette of some figure watching us. It was faint, but it was illuminated by the full moon, and it was huge. We just kind of stared at it in shock for a moment before backing away. We went to get our friend's dad and some flashlights. He was intent on showing us there was nothing there. We got back to the spot, and it was still there. We shone our flashlights on it, but it wasn't enough to get a better look. But the thing's eyes shone red with the reflection of the flashlight. We watched it watching us for a bit, and it walked along the embankment, then walked back and disappeared into the woods. That was more than a decade ago, and we rarely talk about it, and we were all pretty freaked out. Back in high school, a couple of my friends and I were bored one summer night, and looking for something to do in my friend's neighbourhood, other than the usual, which was get high. There was this abandoned house at the end of the main street, and we had heard all kinds of stories as to why it had been abandoned, from creepy to financial problems. So being a bunch of little rebels, we decided to break in through the boarded up bathroom window in the back of the house. As soon as we crawled in, there was broken glass all over the bathroom windows, being shattered from the previous vandals, and old newspaper remnants of all previous tenants' personal belongings everywhere. There were 7 of us, including myself that I can recall, and 2 girls with us if memory serves correctly. So, we all scattered around the house, rummaging around looking for anything of value. I was walking around, just sifting through things, trying to figure out why it looked like the previous owners just up and left everything. As I was walking back towards one of the rooms, I took a glance towards the kitchen and saw 2 of my friends at the dining room table. One of them was a girl. They were there with a flashlight, inspecting what was on the table. I was in the process of turning back around and heading into the room that I was just in, when I saw the other one of the girls just standing at the kitchen sink, staring perfectly still into it. I stood there for a second thinking, she must be high, and laughed a little to myself, then proceeded to head into the room to do a little bit more exploring. When I was done exploring the room, I came back out, and my friends were still at the table just conversing about their findings, but the girl by the sink was gone, so I walked up to them and joined in on their conversation, thinking nothing of the matter. The other girl that we were with came out of the garage with the rest of my guy friends, and then it hit me. So I asked the girl why she was staring at the kitchen sink. She looked at me, confused, and said that she'd been in the garage the whole time, to which the other friends testified. At this point I was freaking out, and stated to everyone, well, who did I see in the kitchen a little while ago? They all expressed that nobody had been in the kitchen or at the sink. So after I said that, we got the hell out of there, and I made sure that I wasn't the last one out. After that, none of us have been back there since.
It was kind of a rainy, drizzly day on a Sunday in April. Me and my guy friend had planned to hang out the day before. We're both the same age, 14. I left my house around 10 in the morning because we had planned to get breakfast also. We met up on our bikes at the corner of a random street near my house, and he suggested that we leave the neighborhood and go to a different town. I knew my mom probably wouldn't have wanted me to go to a different town on her own, but I wanted to, so I didn't tell her. We headed off on our bikes. It took us about an hour and a half to fully get 3 towns over. We got food at some cafe on the way, but we ended up in a sketchy neighborhood. We rode our bikes around looking for something to do, until we stumbled upon an abandoned house. We parked our bikes on the side of a house behind a large bush, so no one would see them, and we looked around. It looked pretty broken down, and had a very creepy look to it. The house had a fair amount of caution and do not enter signs on it, which was enough of a warning to us, but we didn't listen. We ended up trespassing and breaking into the house through the back door that was open. I didn't want to because I was a bit of a scaredy cat and wasn't really the taking risks kind of type. I believe we would have gotten into trouble, but we never did, so he forced me into going in. There was a small broken wooden fence that you had to climb over before you were standing on the actual porch, where the back door of the house was. The fence was broken with pieces of wood and glass sticking out, so you had to be careful climbing over it. The house smelled of rotten eggs and mold. I had a pit of guilt and fear in my stomach. I was scared out of my mind, and jumped at every little creak and noise that came from inside the broken down old house. We looked for anything valuable on the first floor of the house, but there wasn't much. We stumbled upon a creaky old staircase that was leading up to the second floor. I had no intention of following my friend up there. He went up himself, and I waited at the bottom. He finally convinced me to come up with him, so I did. Again, we didn't really find anything that valuable, except for some fake jewelry and old pictures of the previous family members who once occupied the house. After raiding everything we could, we went back downstairs. Okay, here's where the scary part comes into play. We again found ourselves searching the bottom half of the house, finding a couple of secret rooms we hadn't seen before. I suggested countless times that we should leave before someone finds us, or we get hurt, but my friend replied with, 1 minute and we will leave. But we never did. We stopped dead in our tracks when we heard some faint footsteps coming from the upstairs area, right above where we were standing. We made eye contact with each other, both terrified. I mouthed, "You hear that too?" And he replied back with, "Yeah." After a couple of seconds, we heard a door slam from upstairs. We bolted for the back door as fast as we could and slammed it shut behind us. My friend had quickly hopped over the broken fence on the back porch. He was taller than me, so it was easier for him. But for me being quite a short girl, it was not that easy. I ended up hopping over as fast as I could before my other leg was over the fence. I felt something freezing cold brush past my ankle. I didn't look behind me. I just threw myself over the fence. I twisted my ankle and got a small cut on my leg, and it was bleeding a lot. I limped to our bikes that were behind the bush where we had left them, and we were off. We both headed straight home after that, and decided not to talk about what we saw ever again. When I got home, I noticed where I had felt a cold breeze on my ankle, and there was a large bruise. I will never sneak into anywhere abandoned ever again.
I had to attend a family reunion a few years ago. Unfortunately, I really didn't have the money to fly, nor the money to stay in a hotel on the way. So my plan was to drive the entire way and sleep at rest areas in my car. It made sense to me, as it would ensure that I would be able to visit my relatives. It was a 3-day trip, so I would be sleeping in the car for at least 2 nights. I brought along some pillows and blankets so that I could curl up in the back seat. The first night came and went with no incident. I found a rest area and was able to just hang out in the parking lot. The second day of driving, however, had me going through the mountains. I had never made this trip before, so I wasn't sure if I would find a rest area. I drove for a very long time, and when my eyes were beginning to close, I figured I would just have to pull out on the side of the road to get a little rest. It was much harder to go to sleep this time, but at least it was quiet and dark. Very few cars actually came across. I'm not really sure how long I had been asleep for before I felt something wake me up. I thought my car had moved a bit, but then I assumed it was probably just something I felt when I was sleeping. I closed my eyes, and then I felt it again. My car bobbed up and down a bit. I was afraid. peeking out from under the blankets, I caught sight of someone standing at the front of my car. He had his foot resting on the bumper, and it was he who was pushing it down with his foot, causing my car to bob. I was about to hide back under the blankets when I looked to the side window and saw a second person there peeking into the side window. I jumped, and when I did, I saw the first guy leave the front of the car and come around to the side window where I was. He viciously tried opening my door, which fortunately was locked, and then started banging on my window. I was completely freaked at this point and decided that the best thing to do would be get into the front seat and start to drive. Right before I started the car though, the first guy succeeded in busting in my window. I yelled, but then quickly pulled away. I have no clue why those guys were antagonizing me, but I did not stop driving until I got to the reunion, and I have never slept in my car again. In the 80s, my cousin was on a camping trip with his wife. It wasn't a busy day for camping, and according to my cousin, the ranger told them that they were the only ones camping there that night. Anyway, so it's getting late, and my cousin said he spots something across the lake. He thought it was a bear standing, so he grabs his binoculars. He said it wasn't a bear because it had a face, like a 70-year-old man, and the fur was longer than that of a bear. He thought maybe it was someone in a suit. It disappeared quickly, whatever it was. He was spooked and wanted to leave the park immediately. His wife thought he was being ridiculous though, and just having an overactive imagination. She had bought a shotgun and insisted that they would be fine if anything happened. So that night everything is going fine, until my cousin is awakened by footsteps. His wife is still asleep, but he doesn't want to wake her. He just tries to keep as still and as quiet as possible. A figure approaches the tent. My cousin said he was positioned so that his head was on the corner of the tent. The figure leans down and gently presses its hands around the corner of the tent. So the figure is basically putting its hand around my cousin's head. I don't remember how long he said it lasted, but this figure eventually left. My cousin said it smelt like mechanical things, like someone was working on a car, although he had no car. The next morning, everything at the campsite was untouched. No problems at all. There wasn't any evidence that anyone had been there. He eventually went and researched the area, and discovered that the camping area is supposedly a hotspot for Bigfoot and such. He firmly believes that he saw some kind of Sasquatch.
This wasn't strictly in an abandoned building, but my old college campus had an odd building that was shaped like an authentic Scottish castle, down to towers, parapets, walls, etc. Mind you, only the outside was designed to look like a castle, with every room inside just being squeezed in wherever it could fit, so it was already famous for no two rooms being identical, as well as other architectural oddities such as staircases that led nowhere, and needing to go up and down a floor to reach a room right next to you, so it was already something of a weird, creepy building, to say the least. It was used mainly as a dorm, but a lot of it, especially the outer towers and walls, was closed off to the public. So I think those areas should count, and yes, there was a good amount of really weird stuff there. The first time I explored there, I had found a small door that was mostly rusted shut on the bottom of one of the rear towers. It was unused, but I could still open it enough to get through, so I came back that night to explore. It led to a small circular room on the inside of the tower, with a bunch of debris on the floor, like pallets, some old chairs, and a big metal plate. More on that later. However, above me, there was an open square hole that clearly led to another room inside, in what would be the top of the tower, where a ladder had probably been at one point. Once I got up there, I couldn't believe what I saw. The whole room was filled with hundreds of broken mirror shards, chained together by a string and hanging from the ceiling, as well as all over the floor and the windowsills. Also scattered on the floor were what at first looked like dozens of big coins, but on closer inspection, it turned out to be metal rims of those cheap little tea candles, stomped flat by people walking on them. Finally, in the center of the room, there was a tiny little table, on top of which was a metal bowl filled with more mirror shards, surrounded by more empty candles. I have no idea what the fuck that room had been used for, but I swear to God, it looked like some ritual shit was going down there. I took some pictures on my phone so my friends would believe me, but it was the middle of the night. All I had was a dim flashlight, and the phone cameras were shit back then, so nothing really came out of that. That was probably the single weirdest thing I saw exploring there, but the most heart-stopping thing easily came after I came back later and discovered what was under the big metal plate. Apparently, there was a whole system of tunnels, ranging from 2x4 high, that followed the castle walls all the way around, giving access to many of the other towers, to which I had just found the only entrance. Of course, I had to see what was down there. It was all a dirt floor, with lots of metal wires and bars sticking out in random places, and there I was, crawling around on my hands and knees, holding my flashlight in my teeth, trying to see where I could get to. Some parts, probably the section under parts of the walls that were used for storage, sort of opened up so that I could sort of crouch and look around the trash where students had probably hidden and forgot things over the years. But I'm a pretty small guy. I was only 5'6" and 110 pounds back then. I even had to struggle to squirm through some of the passages, which were sometimes partially filled by plumbing, leading me to wonder what the hell these passages were made for, if it's too tight for anyone but a scrawny teenager. Anyway, it was in one of these super tight passages, 5 feet underground, that I had one of the most terrifying experiences in my life. Turning around a corner, I saw exactly what you don't want to see in a place like that. Sneakers, connected to a pair of jeans. As I adjusted my flashlight, which again was in my teeth, it got worse. A red flannel shirt, not empty and lying flat mind you, but very much filled and body-shaped, lying in the tunnel facing away, just a few feet in front of me. I don't get scared a lot, but I could feel the color drain from my face, just looking at what appeared to be a goddamn murder victim, stashed away in some dark tunnel under a dorm to be forgotten. I don't know how I mustered the courage to keep going, but I kept getting closer. It was also clear that it didn't have a head either. I finally got a good enough angle sneaking by it to see where the head had been, only to see a speaker membrane under the shirt collar. The whole thing was a fucking mannequin, dressed up like a human, with wireframe arms and legs, probably as some old Halloween prop, hence the speaker. God only knows why someone decided that this of all places was the best part to hide it.
The woods near where my father grew up have plenty of old abandoned houses scattered through them. I'm from the Hudson Valley, and anyone who lives around the area can confirm that the woods have old houses, or at the very least some foundations remaining within them. When he was younger, he and everyone else would basically climb up this mountain to an abandoned house. He said it had a lot of old black and white nudes, but a lot of kids would go up to smoke and hang out, and things were smashed. Part of the trip up the mountain basically involved climbing up a cliff, just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was also his usual way down, so one night he went up alone, and was working his way down. Night was settling in, and he was lowering himself down to the drop, and he felt an odd presence, and glanced towards where he had just been standing. Basically, what he saw was a quick glance, because whatever it was just made him climb down the mountain and run home. He described it as very tall, lumbering above him and covered in hair. and it most certainly wasn't a bear. Whenever he tells this story, he always trembles just remembering it. Every once in a while, I'll go urban exploring with my friends. Usually, he just checks out abandoned places and the odd factory or two. It can be a really cool experience for anyone who is into history or photography or asbestos inhalation. Today though, he decided that we were going to go to a local abandoned hospital at night with just the two of us because it would be more intense. Despite my mild hesitations, we ended up getting to the place and it started to get dark. We make our way through a window that someone else has torn the boarding off, and my friend gives his usual yell throughout the building, announcing his presence so that we don't startle anyone who might be inside, saying, "We're not the cops, we're just looking around and taking some pictures." By his logic, we're doing a courtesy to anyone else exploring the building who may panic if they hear someone else coming. By my logic, we're announcing our presence to every homeless person in the building who might want to steal a camera from two dumb kids. Despite my fears, nothing bad happens. We make our way through the building, going through multiple floors and checking out the roof last. We get a ton of cool pictures and take a look at some of the creepy ass old bathtubs and tables they left in place. There's some really cool graffiti inside as well, mixed in with your usual shitty tags. The whole building is pitch black, except for a few spots where the moonlight shines through, so we literally can only see whatever happens to be pointing at our phones at the time we use the flashlight or the camera. Even though I'm still worried about being murdered, I'm glad I went, and I'm less freaked out as we're making our way out through the window that we came in. We get back in the room, and I hop out the window first, and have my buddy pass me the camera. As I take it from him and he starts climbing out the window, a soft voice from what sounds like 10 feet inside the building says, "Wait." I look around at my friend, and we can just barely see a silhouette standing in the doorway from where we entered the room. Now, I'm not proud of what happened next, but in that moment, the force in which my butthole puckered and propelled me away from that building with enough forced momentum to last until I was at the edge of the property back towards my road. My friend followed after me quickly, more so to laugh at me than out of fear. He didn't seem to be too worried about it, although he agreed that we definitely weren't going back. What terrified me the most is that we were 100% sure that we were alone in that building. It was dead silent apart from us. And the fact that this man waited until right as we were leaving horrified me, as it made me realise that he could have been watching us and following us throughout the entire building, just listening to us talk, watching us speaking, watching us taking pictures. Best to avoid those kind of creeps.
I lived a few towns away from a decommissioned World War II hospital that was used up into the 80s. This place was quite far from the nearest town, and was right out in the sticks, and when it was decommissioned, they effectively built a wall around the grounds, we're talking like half a mile square, and left it be. There were equipment, cars, beds, personnel records, and fully furnished apartment block for hospital staff. It's like they upped and left one day, leaving everything behind. So a few years back, we had to plan to do a full 4-hour expedition under cover of darkness. We park up at a pub 1.5 miles away and walk the rest. We managed to scale the wall using a tree, and we were in. The hospital was creepy as hell. Picture 2 massive parallel corridors that run the entire length of the main hospital, with hundreds of rooms on each side. And when standing at one end, you can't see the opposite end. We decided to take the logical approach and start from the top of the corridor and work our way down, having a look in each room as we go. Most rooms are creepy, old, run-down versions of wards and procedure rooms. However, one room, labeled Chapel, was a built-in church. However, unlike the other rooms, this one was burnt out and completely scorched. We stayed for a while, but then moved on. After leaving the chapel, we heard a loud bang come a few rooms up. The source of the bang was from this huge 15 feet by 15 feet, 5-inch thick iron box. It looked like an oversized safe. The door was heavy and matched the sound we heard, but it took a lot of effort to move, so we had no idea how it made the sound without help. We continued on and re-entered the corridor, however. Looking back from what was once a relatively clear corridor was now a single wheelchair right in the middle, facing the door leading to the chapel. Both a little freaked, we start thinking about wrapping up our adventure. However, neither of us wanted to walk past the wheelchair to get back to the entrance. We decided to cut through to the parallel corridor, go to the end, and cut back through, back to the primary corridor. We reached the entrance again, but before we left, we shone our torch down towards the chapel and noticed the wheelchair was now facing us. My friend at this point was getting very agitated and yelled. However, nothing happened. We go to leave, and we both hear a whimper coming from the corridor. We ran so fast and got back to the car ASAP. We initially thought it was someone screwing with us, but the amount of sound that echoed around when walking and the debris on the floor exacerbating the sound, we are sure we would have heard anybody moving in such close proximity to us. We went back during daylight, a couple of days late, and couldn't find a single wheelchair in the main corridor, or any room connected to it. We did find a room full of them, on the opposite side of the hospital. Was the oddest thing.
My buddy and I were fishing at a certain fort in Jamestown. At one point, my buddy decided to walk to the boat dock around 50 yards away. The whole walk there, he said that he sensed someone behind him and heard footsteps. He thought I was walking with him, but when he turned around, he was alone. He said it creeped him out pretty bad, and he never went back to that spot with me. Now fast forward to next summer. I decided to fish this spot by myself. I had completely forgotten about my friend's experience. I got to the dock and unloaded everything and started to soak some bait. It was a clear moonless night with no wind nor breeze. About a half hour into watching my rod, I started to smell perfume around me. I thought it was pretty weird since I was the only person out there. The smell kept getting stronger and stronger, so I walked about 10 feet to my right, and the smell disappeared. Then I walked back to my original spot, and the perfume smell was still there, stronger than ever. It was so strong, to the point that my nose started to feel burn. At that point, I said, "Where the hell is this smell coming from?" And soon after I said that, the smell disappeared. That's when I packed up and left, and I have not been back to that fishing spot ever since. This happened in England in 2001. I was 19 at the time and living in London, and headed north for the weekend to visit my friend from Melbourne, who was just living outside of Leeds at the time, in a town called Harrogate. Not far from where he lived was Harewood Castle, an abandoned 14th century castle and fortress with an interesting past. After arriving and enjoying a pleasant dinner with his host family, he and I decided to make the short walk to explore the ruins. despite the stern and frankly excessive warnings from his host family to under no circumstances go to the ruins at night. It's 11:30 p.m, so away we go. The castle had recently been commissioned for a £1 million restoration, which was yet to get underway. As such, the decaying castle was only reachable by crossing an ancient moat, still full of liquid sludge, and fairly significant steel fencing, which was set up to keep exuberant young folks like ourselves at bay. We managed both relatively easily. It's a windy, cloudless evening, with a fair chunk of moon out, giving us a reasonably decent light to explore the ruins. My friend suggests that we climb the spiral staircase connecting the courtyard to the top of the castle, which had great views for miles. After we climb up the pitch-black staircase using our hands to guide us, we sit on the parapet, talking about life. After about an hour or so, we decide to head back down to the host's house. I enter the spiral first, and about halfway down the spiral staircase, my friend, chatting incessantly, stops talking completely. Without being able to see him, I sense that he'd stopped moving altogether. I ask him if he's okay, and get no response. I ask again, no response. I move back up the staircase and grab his arm. No response. My heart rate is going through the roof, but I manage after some time to get him moving. He still hasn't spoken. I reach the bottom of the staircase first, and jump down into the courtyard. The distance in height between the bottom of the existing courtyard and where the wooden floor was centuries ago is about 5 or 6 feet. And after landing safely, I turn and look towards my friend, who has just entered the moonlight from the shadow of the castle. His face has a calm, almost trance-like expression on it, and he is looking over the top of me still mute. After a truly strange few seconds that feel like an eternity, my friend's right shoulder jerks forward violently, as if he were pushed extremely hard by a strong adult. The force of the push causes him to lurch forward, spin, and land flat on his back, legs and feet in the air, 6 feet down on the courtyard floor. Suddenly he snaps out of it, and begins screaming at the top of his lungs, a strange sound given he's badly winded. He then gets up, and proceeds to do 5 laps of the courtyard at Usain Bolt's speed, searching for the exit, while still screaming. I catch him, and steer him out of the exit. We careen down the castle hill towards the steel fencing, the moat, and hopefully, the track back to Harrogate. My friend nearly hurdles the 10-foot steel fence, before sliding further down the hill, and falling straight into the sludge moat, completely submerging himself, and with superhuman strength, the swamp monster manages to scramble out of the moat, which thankfully is relatively shallow, and tears off up the track. I climb the fence, transverse the moat, and chase him back to the host's house. When I arrive, my friend is inside. The commotion has awoken the family, who stands in the kitchen gawking warily at the swamp monster. With nothing else said, the father stares at my friend, then at me, then back at my friend before saying in his thick and wonderful West Yorkshire accent, "What did I tell you?" before proceeding to tie up his dressing gown and go back to bed.
A couple years ago, my partner and I had freshly moved into a shared rental where I'd be closer to work. At the time, I didn't have my license, so my partner would take me every Friday to work at the local veterinarian clinic. They were 5-minute trips back and forth to work on Friday mornings and evenings. We had spotted an abandoned farmhouse located next to a local abattoir, packed to the irrigation channel at the end of the driveway, with large trees and shrubs. It was obviously abandoned for a long time for established trees to have barricaded the only entrance. One of my favorite things to do was a venture into the abandoned, so one of the following nights we decided to drag along a housemate to check it out with us. To get to this house, we had to cross the irrigation channel, which was flooded at the time, in the neighboring swampy paddock. After lots of walking through slop, hiding from passing cars and abattoir workmen, we finally managed to scale across another channel to be in the yard of the abandoned house. Before entering the house itself, we checked out the shed, full of 70s era furniture and garbage really, and an old school book belonging to a teenager from many years ago, with pictures of Brendan Fraser plastered all over the back and front. We entered the house and discovered it was abandoned, as its construction contained asbestos. Nothing happened that night, and we set off back home to have a much needed shower. Visit number 2. After a few months, we decided to take another friend to come see this creepy house, this time hoping to stay longer to really get to know the place. All the same process of entering, and this time we went straight to the front door. My partner stood on the front step, reached for the handle, then we heard hurried footsteps. It was like a humanoid stride, starting at the end closest to us, to the far side of the house. We all paused and looked at each other, sort of freaking out. My partner insisted that we continue the adventure, so we opened the door. The first thing we noticed was that the closet in the entrance was open, when it wasn't the last time. And the second thing that we noticed, although this time was closer to summer, the house got very cold. After inspecting the cupboard, I then closed it. Before we made ourselves comfortable, we checked every room to make sure no one was there, checked every cupboard and hideaway. Once we established there was no squatters or humans other than ourselves in the house, we decided to do the old dreaded circle thing, to talk to what we thought may be a ghost. We made a circle in the kitchen of the house, me, my partner, and my very hard to scare female friend, who seemed to be enjoying all of this. My partner and friend were too shy to speak out, so I started by asking, "Is anyone there?" There was no reply. I then proceeded to blabber on, saying things like, "We won't hurt you, we just want to know if you're here, and we promise we won't take anything." After a while of no response, apart from growing amounts of cold, I gave up in my mind. But before I could say I give up, the cupboard in the front entrance, which was behind me, started to creak open. My first thought was that we touched that though. It could just be a loose door, but as I turned around, those same hurried footsteps rushed from behind me to get out of the house. No one was there, just empty footsteps. Of course my reaction was, "This is fucked. Let's go home now. Fuck." And we rushed home pretty quick that time. We have since been to visit the house to show another friend, but it was clear the house had been disturbed by squatters, so there was nothing paranormal that night, just the usual marks of degenerate society in an abandoned house.
I was staying in a cabin on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland in the mountains. One day we were snowed in, and when you're snowed in up there you're stuck. Now there are plenty of bears and deer up there. We keep salt licks, corn, and all other kinds of stuff around, not to hunt, but just to feed them. Well, I walk by the back window, which is over the underground garage, where we keep our snowmobiles and the four-wheelers. I see this big brownish looking thing in the woods, probably 50 feet away from the cabin, just sitting in the snow. I was shocked because I'd never really seen a bear there, but heard some stories about them being around. So I ran to get my mum and show her. As we walked back to the window, the damn thing stood up. And I don't mean like a bear, I mean big, tall man standing up. It just turned around and walked with a huge stride. It took off into the woods. We stood there shocked. What the hell was that? My uncle just casually says, "Oh, that's Sasquatch. He's a celebrity round here." I don't know if he was just trying to make us feel better by diffusing the situation with comedy. But after that, I never went into those woods alone again.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Happy almost Halloween. Merch is being put on hold for one more day, because I just want to try and make some final changes. But I'm pretty sure it will be out tomorrow. Please be sure to drop in tomorrow for a very, very special episode. It will be nice and long, just the way you guys like them. So this Halloween, remember that I have got you sorted. I hope to see you tomorrow. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider dropping a like and leaving a comment, as it's a really great way to help support the channel, and I appreciate it tremendously. And if you'd like to do something incredible to help support the channel further, feel free to visit my Patreon. You can find the link in the description as well as the links to my social media pages. And if you would like me to read your story on my channel, you can submit it to me as a text post to Reddit or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.